how great everyone's doing. Welcome, everybody. I so appreciate you joining us and following the waiting room instructions to join with mics and cameras off. We would love to see your faces. However, it is a lot easier to see our presenters and our interpreter and a PowerPoint on a tiny screen if we don't have lots of other faces. So I am so glad that you are here with us this afternoon. My name is Michelle Niehaus, and I am the Program Administrator for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services at the Kentucky Department for Behavioral Health, Developmental, and Intellectual Disabilities. Today, we are joined by a communication access team. We have Don Caudill, Jessica Mingus, both as our interpreters, and we have Tracy Lundergan as our captioner today. You can enable the live captions. These are professional captions, not automatic. If you go to the toolbar on the bottom of your screen, you have a couple options there. You'll be able to watch the transcript as it goes, and you can watch it at the bottom of your screen as well. We are recording today, and so if you want to check us out, or if you want to watch this again or share the good information with your teams, you can take it and share it with them through our YouTube channel, probably sometime late next week. I'm going to drop the chat into the chat, the YouTube address. So there are lots of resources there, and we would love to have you share that information. So that should be going up to you all right about now. This is the third session in our Communication Access series, and you can watch the previous sessions on that YouTube channel as well. We are not providing CEUs for this session. If you need a certificate of attendance, please email me, and I will put my email address in the chat once we get started as well. Today, you are in for a real treat. We have two national speakers who are experts on hearing assistive technology and know the impact that not hearing well can have on behavioral health. They also know what positive change can happen in a person's life if they receive the supports needed to address hearing loss and its effects. Dr. Juliet Sturkins is an audiologist and consultant with the Hearing Loss Association of America, and Wynn Wyman works with the national nonprofit, the Center for Hearing Access. We are coming to you from Kentucky, Colorado, and Wisconsin today, and everybody has different kinds of weather. So one of the things we may encounter are technical difficulties because of that. If so, we will use grace and humor. We will figure it out together. In the background today, we have Anthony Atkins, who is helping with technology. So thank you, Anthony, for that as well. And our presenters have a ton of information to share with you. So I want to just hand it over to them. Thank you so much, Dr. Sturkins and Wynn, and I look forward to learning from you. Take it away,
Thank you.
please.
I am going to get this show on the road. And I really appreciate the invitation, Michelle. And I have a disclaimer slide to begin with that the information should not be construed as legal or medical advice. I'm an audiologist. Wynn is a learning expert, adult learning expert. The products and the equipment that we used or show in our presentation are for illustration. They're not product endorsements. And of course, if we don't mention some things, doesn't mean that we disapprove of them. Neither one of us has any financial interest in any product. Wynn has a paid position with the National Nonprofit Center for Hearing Access, and I receive a consulting fee from the Hearing Loss Association of America, HLAA, thanks to grant funding from a private family foundation, David and Carol Myers Foundation. And here is the overview about the Center for Hearing Access. It is a national nonprofit founded last year. It's based in Eugene, but WIN is located in Colorado, and we are all about hearing access. We are there to educate consumers, professionals. We want to give the good, useful information about ADA compliant assistive listening systems and other strategies to improve hearing access. There's a ton of materials on that website. It's called the Center for Hearing or centerforhearingaccess.org. Lots of information about ADA. We provide presentations for a variety of groups. There's videos, all kinds of templates. If you see something and for some reason you can't download it, contact one of us and we'll be happy to help you. It's really about empowering consumers with good information about assistive listening. And our hopes for this presentation, why we do what we do. We want to build knowledge about the tools that are out there. And we want you as professionals to think very critically about how you are dealing with people who have hearing difficulties. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the need, the ideas for communication by providers, challenges and ideas for solutions, and resources. Um, so in the chat, we would love it, and we would approach that later on after our presentation. But obviously, you made a decision today to spend an hour and a half with us, and you're hoping to get some information. And I call them pearls, pearls of wisdom. When I go to events, if I come home with two or three pearls, I'm a happy camper. So, what is it that you're looking for? What is it that you need in your work with clients or colleagues? In other words, what do you hope to gain from this session? So, by all means, start typing away. And I am give it over to Win at this moment.
Hey, so everybody, hello, I'm Win, and this little girl sits on top of my computer screen. It's a little Lego girl. She's about 2 inches if she stands up, and it was given to me by a dear friend a few weeks ago because we both have cochlear implants on our left side. So embedded in the hair is a cochlear implant. And if you pull off her hair, it's Lego. You pull off the hair, and on the right side is a hearing aid. And so it's the perfect little doll because it represents me. That's what I have and what I use. I am streaming all of the audio directly to my devices because that gives me the clearest sound possible. And that's always my goal is to get that clear sound because it's less work to be trying to figure out the interpretation of the language with it. And so, with this little girl with my hearing loss, I've had a progressive hearing loss since I was a preschooler. So, if you go full speed to where I am today, that means my right ear, I am continuing to lose hearing, but my left ear with the cochlear implant, I am hearing better than with my hearing aid on my right side. So I can go outside. I'm constantly, because I've only had my cochlear like almost 2 years now. So I go outside and it's like, oh, I can hear the birds. And then I remove my magnet and I'm like, they're really quiet or they totally vanish. So it's really fun to be playing with that, with those environmental sounds. But on the same side of, I am still working hard to understand what a digital sound means and to increase my word recognition. Some things, some people come in and they sound normal to me, and other things still sounds like it's somebody talking through an elevator speaker with a hollow sound, with missing and weird sounds. So it's still a process. And so with that journey of having hearing loss almost my entire life, I've gone from living before the ADA to after the ADA, before there was much said about tinnitus, to now there's national conventions, before with nobody taught me advocacy, to here I am doing national advocacy. So it's been quite a journey and just delightful to have the job that I have. It's just to be doing this advocacy and education full time is just tremendous. With that, before I did this and started last year, I was working with executive leadership curriculum development and designing new courses and such. And so with some of you on the call as providers, leadership is about behavioral change. Working in the psychological field is about behavioral change. And so I worked with a lot of psychologists, also executive coaches that also had that psychology mindset. And so I come today and hoping to be a bridge that's saying the two of us know quite a bit about hearing loss. You all know your clients, what your offices are doing, what you're trying to provide people, and have some of that expertise. So by providing some information and some resources, I hope then afterwards you can continue that further and enact some of the things that's needed to serve people. So I'm thrilled that this course even exists in this whole series. There's a huge need for people with hearing loss and supporting them in different ways through your services. So if you could go to the next slide, please. I first want to talk about the terminology. So I come from a person of where I identify as I'm a person with hearing loss. That's who I am because I am continually learning about it. I'm learning in different ways. I'm educating. And at the same time, I am continuing to lose some of my hearing. Other people identify differently. They don't have that kind of a mindset, and that's okay. It gets convoluted because this is about a medical diagnosis, a self-identity, it's about communication, and people are going to identify different ways. So I prefer not to use hearing impaired. I recognize that is a medical diagnosis. It's needed. But when it's used, sometimes it can be that used that you are a less than. You're not a whole person if you are impaired. And focusing more on that whole person is much better. So I don't like that one. Hard of hearing, sometimes I identify because that's the language I need to use just so people understand to say, oh yeah, hard of hearing, this is what we have for you. But it gets confusing because some people hear hard of hearing and they say, here's a sign language interpreter for you. Well, one person who's hard of hearing might need a sign language interpreter, but not me because I've only had 3 classes and I can understand a few bits of the communication, but not a lot. So if you could click, Juliet, the next one, I have a build here. So where we've landed right now in Colorado, just sharing, is back up just a little bit. There we go. So
Oh,
with our,
sorry.
it's okay. We're human. Um, that instead of focusing on identity, we are focusing on communication. And by focusing on communication, that helps to clarify the needs and some of the changes that we're trying to do. So we have a group that's focused on the needs around the ASL community, and then another community who use the spoken language. So just wanted to share, and if you want to read more about this language, throughout here, I've included links the oldies but goodies, 'cause sometimes there's some really good stuff, but it's older. And then the newer ones from January with that. So next slide, please. And then the other thing I want to mention is a medical model versus a social model. And models give us perspectives with how we think. And how we think is a mindset with how we can sometimes behave and interpret the world. So a medical model is that it's focused on the impairments and on fixing the impairments. So that's very much needed as far as what's going on with our hearing system, how can it be better, figuring it all out, absolutely essential. But sometimes that translates. So I went to my PA, new PA, and in my medical, I have hearing stuff all over the place. And at the end of it, I said, we haven't talked about my hearing. And she said, well, if you couldn't understand me, I expect you to tell me that you don't understand, i.e., if you let me know, I will fix it for you. So that's very much of that medical mindset. In comparison is the social model, and that is creating an environment with attitudes, the environmental context to be able to have that environment already fixed or to create a good environment so people can just fully participate. And that's a different way of thinking things. And that's what we're going to be suggesting in throughout this today is that what can you do so that people don't have to ask, that things are going to be ready, they're going to be welcome and included with that. So our approach is we need both. Not one is better than the other, but we need both in society going forward. Next slide.
And that's my cue. Because I'm an audiologist and I didn't give any background information, but I moved to the United States to complete my master's degree, and I have since obtained an audiology doctorate level degree. But I grew up in a household with a father who was very hard of hearing in the high frequencies only. So he could hear a truck drive up on the driveway, but he sometimes couldn't understand his daughters speak, and in background of noise or at parties, my father loved to dance because that way he could say, oh, I can't hear, I'm dancing, and he would focus on the dancing. Women love that about him. So, why do people have trouble hearing in background of noise? And I'm going to go back to that audiogram that was shown in a previous lecture. And all I want you to be aware of that in the audiogram, every dot in this audiogram is worth 1% of speech discrimination, speech understanding. So if your hearing is somewhere in the 0 to 20 decibel range, meaning in a typical hearing range, you are able to hear each and every dot, so to speak, and therefore understand 100%. So the more dots are made audible above that hearing threshold, the more speech energy is going to be perceived, the easier it's going to be to understand speech. But some dots are more important than others, and I'm going to try and explain that. The low frequency tones on the left side of the graph represent mostly the vowel sounds in speech. And vowels give you the timbre, the emotion. Just by hearing my voice, you'll know if I'm happy or sad or excited. That's just conveyed in the low frequencies only. You don't need to hear the high frequencies in order to hear whether I'm a male or a female, for example. But it's the high tone area that provide the comprehension. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's a lot more dots in that high frequency area. Now, this is important because the vowel sounds in the low frequencies carry about 80% of the intensity, but the consonants only carry 80% of the intelligibility. And what I mean by that is if you can only hear the high frequencies, I'm coming to you from Wisconsin, so I had to put that in there. You would have no trouble understanding if all you get is the consonants of speech. But without any context, you would not be able to make out the second sentence, where I'm only giving you low frequency information. Now, I come from the Netherlands. Maybe that's very helpful. But the sentence is, I love to grow tulips in my garden. All right? So, what happens to people with hearing loss if you have quote unquote normal hearing, typical hearing, and the noise in a room is predominantly in the low frequencies? It's the voices, it's the rumble that continues in a room. You would still have the high frequency sound to make out what people are saying. But what happens to a person who has hearing loss in that same room? And I'm giving you what audiologists might even call a mild hearing loss in the high frequencies. That means that their hearing loss prevents them from hearing all these high frequency sounds above the X's in this audiogram. I'm only showing the left ear just for illustration. But when that person goes into background noise and the noise masks whatever good low pitch hearing they are only going to have 26% of the dots that are audible. And at that point in time, they will say, I can hear, but I can't make out what people are saying. They have to lip read, they have to move closer, they have to do the stretch of the ear and work very, very hard to fill in the gaps. Now, you may think, well, don't hearing aids correct this problem? But there are some major limitations about hearing aids. First of all, hearing aids don't give you normal hearing. At best, they correct for about half of the hearing loss. And the effective range of a microphone on a hearing aid is generally under 10 feet. But for some people with more severe hearing loss, that range is about 1 or 2 arms lengths. And on top of that, some people have such difficulty discriminating speech that even when the sound is loud enough, they can't make out what people are saying. What most people with hearing loss need is clarity, is what is called an improvement in signal to noise ratio. Now, most of us can still make out what people are saying in background of noise if the speech is between 0 and 2 decibels of each other. So if the speech is, let's say, 80 decibels and the noise is about 80 decibels, I can still make out about 80%, 50% of what people are saying. And by lip reading and by looking at people, I can follow the conversation. But there's plenty of people who may have a 5 or a 10 decibel loss in signal to noise ratio. That means, for starters, in order to make out 50%, they need speech to be 10 decibels louder than the background noise in order to understand that 50%, obtain that 50% discrimination. And as we all know, 50% doesn't make for easy listening, it makes communication possible. But in order to sit back and hear, you may need a 20 decibel difference between the signal and the background noise. This type of determining this type of loss requires speech in noise testing, by the way, that not all audiologists will complete, but that has been determined to be very important. So back to that signal to noise ratio. Here is the signal. I am speaking. Here's the background noise, and here you can see the difference between the signal and the noise, which is called signal to noise ratio. Well, what improves signal to noise ratio? And I'm going to get very basic here. By increasing the signal. How do you increase the signal? By either making the noise less or by making the voice louder, by moving closer. For example, by turning down the background noise, by closing a door in a facility if there's noises happening in the background, by asking to turn down the background music in a restaurant, or to do both. Speak a little louder and get some of that background noise to be reduced. But key in some situations, you can't have 50 people come close to you on a stage in order to hear the lecture. That would require the use of a remote microphone or an assistive listening system. And we're going to dive into some of this a little bit closer. So you may think, well, don't hearing aids improve the signal to noise ratio to the point where somebody can hear with ease? But the truth is, at best, hearing aids improve signal to noise ratio between 2 and 3 and to about 6 decibels. So if you have a client who needs a 10 or a 15 dB signal to noise ratio improvement, hearing aids will make also the background noise louder and not reduce or not improve the signal to noise ratio enough that they can make out what people are saying. A remote microphone that we show in this picture right here can improve the signal to noise ratio by about 12 dB. And that can simply be a matter of clipping a small microphone on a lapel. And now you can sit in the meeting room beyond that hearing effective range of a hearing aid. Assistive listening systems can easily improve the signal to noise ratio up to 30 decibels. So in our lecture, we're going to give you ideas for improving communication access, and we've divided that into situations such as office, dealing with staff, individual sessions, and in group sessions. And this is a quote from somebody with hearing loss saying that my audiologist understood my hearing problems and fit me with hearing aids. But I was still dealing with the grief of my loss and the anxiety of not being able to hear well at work. And the truth is that hearing aids, again, can make hearing easier one-on-one, face-to-face, but not in the more difficult situations. And for someone who is in a difficult work situation, that can certainly add a lot of stress to their job. And then this person went to a psychologist and they didn't get their hearing problems. So she really felt misunderstood, right? So better health, if you're dealing with clients, starts with effective communication. And that really starts by asking what makes, Wynn quoted that example of her healthcare provider saying, oh, you would have told me if you couldn't hear me. But really, the best way would be to approach your client and say, what is it that you need me to do? You may not be aware, but if you're sitting with your back to a window and you have a client face you into the light, that makes lip reading very difficult. You may ask the person to sit beside you so they are not staring into the light. These are some things that you need to be aware of. If the person brings a partner or a family member or an interpreter, communication, of course, should always be happening direct with the client. And then confirm, are you able to hear me? Am I speaking too fast for you? I know I have an accent. I know I have a mustache or a beard. Is that an issue for you? And you definitely want to eliminate some of these distractions in a room so that you are able to give that person full attention. And I can't stress this enough, and you probably noticed that I don't speak a mile a minute. Slow down. Give that person a chance to process the information because they're a little bit like the duck on the pond, right? They seem to be floating along just fine, but underneath their little paws are pedaling like mad. Underneath that sanguine face of your client may be a person who's really trying very hard to interpret what you're saying. And uh, and I did this in my practice. I provided written information as I was dealing with my clients so that they could go home and have that information in writing. And so in the office, you are dealing with patient files, or you're dealing with telehealth. We already mentioned at the beginning of our lecture when you're in a telehealth situation, be sure that you are providing captions. This handout, by the way, will be available on the website. So if you want to review that sometime, but in the file, there should be information so that anybody who opens up the file sees that this person needs good lip reading or needs a lot of visual information or needs captioning turned on during telehealth appointments. Be sure that you have equipment available in the office. And in a next slide, we'll show you some example of the type of equipment that's available. If you're in a situation where you have to wear a mask or you yourself are under the weather and feel that you need to wear a mask, clear masks make lip reading a lot easier, and they should be available, readily available in your office. And all this information obviously should be made available to your clients. And if you are in a situation where you are providing captions or cart transcription, make that cart transcript available for clients, and make sure that you have a list of cart providers in your area that you can rely on. Automatic speech recognition has gotten a lot better. And of course, if you are a clear spoken person and speak very clearly, that can be helpful in a pinch. And if you are not aware, but we have a resource at the end, you can even activate transcriptions right on your phone that can work quite well. In your waiting room, simple. Make sure that you don't just call the person. I've heard many of my clients complain that they were called, but they couldn't hear. And then the second or the third time when a person was called, the caller would almost shout out the name, and then they were embarrassed that that happened. Generally, it's so much better to go out in the waiting room. I know there are some places that even have the vibrating buttons so that no names have to be called. And of course, you can make your waiting room more welcoming by turning on the captions on any TVs that are playing in the lobby. And we've mentioned this before, speak to the client, don't speak to the computer. And if you work in a large office, which I have, I would say, I'm going to walk ahead of you so that you can just follow me into the room and then we'll talk. That's a lot easier than walking behind the client and giving verbal instructions that may or may not be understood. In fact, my husband today had a medical appointment, and the person who was directing him was someone with a very strong accent who spoke extremely rapidly. And he thought she said left, and he immediately went left. That was a dark room, but he didn't know any better. And then she said, no, 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 the next left. Had she walked ahead of him, this wouldn't happen, and he wouldn't have been embarrassed, right? Consider sending text messages. If people have a smartphone, they can be called up that way. For individual sessions, ask about communication access again before you start care. We've mentioned captioning, we've mentioned the personal microphone. Again, this is another example of a personal microphone. So don't be surprised if someone hands you a microphone that you can clip. Be sure to ask how they want that microphone positioned, because there is a microphone. You don't want the microphone pointing down at the floor. You want it pointing up. Very often you see that microphone in photographs positioned sideways, where the microphone is truly not pointing at the mouth of the speaker. Most people will bring their own personal equipment, but it may be useful to have assistive listening devices in your office. These are some very tried and true examples. This is the Pocket Talker from Williams Sound with a headphone. And this is an FM system. I think it's a digital FM system that can work either with headphones or with earbuds. To make a pocket talker work for a person who's very hard of hearing, sometimes a neck loop may be helpful to bring the sound direct into the telecoil of a hearing aid. And here again is a resource for you from Andrea Canab about the type of systems that are available. Assistive listening devices in an office help to bring the sound from a speaker without background noise direct into the hearing aid. And in effect, on this large table, this microphone becomes the microphone to the hearing aid user. So if a microphone is close to your mouth, that person would hear you as if you are this close to his or her hearing aids. And again, if the hearing aid range is limited, these devices can really bring the clarity into the ear. But it's not just for people who are hard of hearing. It may be people who are blind, who are benefiting from an improved signal to noise ratio, those with ADHD or cerebral palsy. Again, these devices reduce background noise. This is a table hearing loop. There's a microphone on the end, and in this picture you can see that loop system essentially provides a cone of sound direct to the hearing aid user. The telecoil, I've mentioned that is a little coil built inside the hearing aid or a cochlear implant that will requiring turning on. If it's a hearing aid that has a button, it generally means just pushing a button on a hearing aid, and you don't need a smartphone or an app on a telephone. But a lot of hearing aids now require that you use an app in order to turn that telecoil on. And it's that telecoil that connects directly to a hearing loop or a neck loop. The app will also allow the user to turn the telecoil volume up and the microphone volume down, again to improve the signal to noise ratio. By the way, when we talk about telecoils, that is a feature inside hearing aids that needs to be programmed and activated by an audiologist or by a hearing instrument specialist. Once that feature is turned on or activated inside the hearing aid, then the consumer can turn it on by pushing a button or using an app on their telephone. And there is a card available if a patient doesn't know about telecoils, you as a professional telling them about it or giving them this resource can be very helpful. And that kind of brings me to um, patients needing a telecoil in their hearing aid. We call these hearing aids ADA access ready hearing aids, and that means these are hearing instruments that include a telecoil and or Auracast. Now, telecoils have been in hearing aids for half a century. And they are still very helpful because the ADA in this country mandates that where a microphone is used, an assistive listening system shall be provided, and that a significant number of the devices that are provided must be telecoil compatible. What is in the future is a system called Auracast, and this system is up and coming. We are unaware of any well-functioning Auracast systems except for a few in the country. I'm aware of a couple, and I'm aware of a system at the Sydney Opera House, for example. But there are not a lot of users of hearing aids that have Auracast built in. So you, as a professional, encouraging clients that if they're talking about hearing aids and you say, are you aware that a telecoil can help you hear better in public places? You may be really providing them with a good service and encouraging them to research this information is very important. We also highly recommend that voc rehab programs provide or pay for hearing aids or stress the importance of hearing aids that have telecoils because it makes the hearing aids far more useful. And hopefully in the near future, we will see that Auracast will be added to hearing aids that already have telecoils, meaning that new devices will come with this technology. You cannot add Auracast to a hearing aid. It needs to be built in. And both of us have been extremely vocal about the need for these ADA access-ready hearing aids. And then I think I'm going to be turning it over to Win.
Yes. So the last area to look at is the group session. So we focused previously about individual solutions and some of the devices they might bring or an office might provide. And then this is moving into that assistive listening that Juliet was talking about. And so going to look at group sessions. So that might be training or that might be just sessions in a group. And so again, just a reminder, check in for communication access. And then also, what are those group norms? So usually when a group comes together, there are some expectations or norms of the group, of agreements that has agreed to with what's going to happen in that group. So there's things like respect and listening and things like that are part of it. But also with that is taking a look at, is it taking care for people who have hearing loss? And so it might mean about what happens in that when there is friction. And the friction with somebody who has hearing loss might be, I didn't quite get that. Can you repeat it? And it puts a burden on the other person or a perceived burden to say, I already told you once, I'm frustrated and it's hard for me to be saying it again. So saying it's okay to ask and it's okay to repeat that communication access is really critical. And some of these, some of the dingers are on the right-hand side of, oh, never mind, or I'll tell you later. And the subtlety to that is saying, what I said is not important enough for me to repeat it for you because you didn't get it the first time. So anything that you can do ahead of time to help with that communication access and to be able to help with what can happen in that group process. Next slide. So in the next slide, we have a picture of a small group. And so just pause a minute and saying, what do you think is working in this setup? Or what might not work in that setup? So yeah, Michelle?
Hi, Wynn. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm having your audio is breaking up a little bit on my end, and I just want to
Okay.
check in with our interpreter to see if that's happening with her as well. Yes. Okay. So I'm not sure if we need to make an adjustment, but we're not getting
Okay.
clear audio on your end right now.
Okay. Is that better? So I have a little table microphone, so I'm holding it in my hand and we'll do
That's way
that. So
better.
thank you for letting me know.
That's way better on my end.
Okay,
Thank you
great.
so much for the adjustment.
You bet. So with this picture and what's working and what might not work with this. And so you look at it and say, okay, what's working? Well, everybody's in a circle. Everybody can see the faces, speech reading, lip reading. That's pretty good. And they're all close together. That's pretty good. There's flip charts, so whatever is auditory is also written down. That's pretty good. But the questions I have are, what are the acoustics of that room? So if it's a hard floor, like a pergo floor or a wooden floor, that sound bounces and it's going to create a hard listening environment for somebody with hearing loss. And so that's something to look at if you have a choice, what room to look at. And then the second thing I'm looking at is I'm not seeing anything with technology in the room. So there's no cart, there's no assistive devices, there's no assistive listening. Next slide. So what might cart be in a room like this? And that is that you take that same room and you just stretch it out so it's like a C and it's around a screen so that everybody has access to the captions. And so there's a picture of the captions and then the captioning equipment. So that's a solution. Next slide. And then another solution is that you add an assistive listening system, which Juliet was talking about. And so what she did is she turned that off and is going to play a video so that you can hear the difference about what it sounds like to use one of these systems versus not using that. So looks like we have technology working. Oh, we got the slides
Maybe
again.
it's not working. Um, hmm. Of course, it worked when we practiced, right?
Right.
Here it goes. So what you'll be hearing is an example of the use of a hearing loop system. And in the example that Win was showing where people are sitting in a circle, it might mean that you have to pass a microphone around. And it may mean, wait, here's the microphone. It slows the communication down a little bit, but it will ensure that people who are hard of hearing will be able to hear so much easier. So the first part is the way a hearing aid user would hear in this large convention center. And the second portion is how the user would hear by turning on the telecoils in the hearing loop.
I'm going to share with you Charlie's story, which begins
No,
in 2015.
This is
He
not
was my second
Charlie's
child,
story.
and
and she was dreading getting older. Well, what's the only way to avoid getting older is to die, right? Now, we all want to live a long life. We apparently just don't want to get old in order to... Sitting there and our young people in their 20s and 30s and 40s making fun of older people, making cracks about older people. They're making fun of what they themselves are going to become.
It's a night and day difference. I was in that room. I was with a patient, or I literally tapped a patient on the shoulder and said, remember, they have a loop here. And then she came back afterwards and said, I could hear every word of that presenter. So it was life-changing. So that was this slide. Can you see the slides again, Win?
Yep, we're up and going. Next slide.
All right.
And so this is just reiterating both what we're saying. We have the audiology perspective, which what Juliet was talking about, the signal to noise, and then just absolutely delighted that in an article in Consumer Reports less than 2 weeks ago, they are understanding and promoting that message that hearing aids alone are not enough. And so I'm quoted in it. I had a lovely conversation with the editor, and that message is coming out, which really helps. Next slide. So there are 6 different types of assistive listening. And if you want to go into the minute details about what the ADA says about this, and Juliet is shaking her head, we did a national webinar on these and you can view them. But that's not what today's session is about. Today's section is about providing communication access. So we are recommending the first 2 with a hearing loop or an FM. Those are the ones that you can focus on. We won't get into the details. And then in a couple slides, I'm going to add a little bit about what Juliet already said about Auracast. It's coming, it's just basically too early. Next slide. And so as you're looking for these systems, or you're thinking about checking yours out that you already have, or you're thinking about putting a new one in, think about you want to make sure that it works wherever it is. It's well maintained, either by yourself or by somebody else. And so in here there's a group in Oregon, and they said, they took a magazine article that said, here are Oregon's 50 best meeting places. And they called every single one of them and logged what the response was. And as you can see from those statistics, it isn't good about does the staff know what it is, or is it well maintained enough so the staff knows how to use it? And so this is, we are intending to give you the practical of this is what's needed, this is how they work, and then the reality is that sometimes there's not working and they need some education. Next slide. Also to help is that we've created a comparison chart between them. So if you're shopping for some type of a system and you're trying to figure out what you'd like to put in for your facility, this guide has been helpful to a lot of people. And you can read, because there's no perfect technology. Every technology has its benefits and its drawbacks with it. So you can read about some of that. And next slide. And then here's a slide about Auracast. So if you haven't heard about Auracast, it's simply it's a new Bluetooth that has a label on it. So it's international. It's going to be a better Bluetooth, and it's called Auracast because it will be available in all devices for people with hearing loss or without hearing loss. And it is in time, it's probably going to be a big game changer, but it's not here yet. And so we've put a best guess of 3, 5, 10 years before it's widely available in facilities, widely available in devices, widely available in phones. And it's going to show up in TVs, like at the gym or in the sports bar, so that you can just tune in through your devices. But we're really focused on that assistive listening with that live sound at the theater. And there's a lot of physics and standards that still need to be figured out. 2027 is the best estimate for those international standards to come out. So if you'd like to read more, we have resources for that. And next slide. So these next two slides we've mentioned about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And these two is just a brief summary of what's the bare minimum basics of what you need to know. Juliet already mentioned about what they do is it just takes that sound from that microphone and brings it straight to the ear. And so there, where it's required is if there's a microphone with loudspeakers, i.e. a public address system. And so that might be in theaters, at events, in a government meeting, or it's a courtroom. So those are the two main areas where it's required. The third area is if it's under effective communication, which is in the next slide. And that with effective communication, next please, it is saying that there are places where it's important for communication for people with disabilities to have equally effective communication as with people without disabilities. So people with hearing loss can request what's called an auxiliary aid or services to help them understand. And it's going to be up to the individual what's going to work for them. So they might want an assistive listening, like a portable hearing loop system at a retail counter. It might be an assistive device, like one of the ones Juliet showed, as far as like a pocket talker or an FM system, or requiring captions. And incidentally, this is the same effective communication if somebody requests a sign language interpreter. It's their way of saying, here is what I need to get effective communication and to be understanding what's happening. Next slide. So a few things about the emotional side, because that gets into the psychological aspects of hearing loss, because it's not just mechanical. It's not you turn it on and you understand instantly or you have 100%. It doesn't fix hearing loss. So what is happening and what are the supports for some of this? Next slide. So the first one is with oral rehabilitation. So some audiologists are very specialized and they offer this service, or they work with a speech language pathologist, SLP, to provide this oral rehabilitation. And they're focused on specific needs and solutions to that. So it's going to be either technologically based and it's also going to be non-technologically based about facing the partner, about enunciation with that. And they do tremendous services, but it's unfortunately not widely available for a lot of reasons. And the bottom line, which is the part with this particular talk, is rarely do they have that expertise about addressing the emotional and the psychological impact about that hearing loss. Next slide. So some of the things that are happening are pretty exciting and good because the research is there. We all know it's hard when you have hearing loss. If you have sudden hearing loss, it's hard in a different way, that you didn't expect it and you have no idea how to deal with it and what it means. So there's grief, there's anxiety, it impacts the relationships. So this group out of Australia did an interviews with a bunch of people that had lived experience, and they listened to the stories and they consolidated it through a very specific process. And they've come up with these 10 areas that need to be addressed. And I think it's going to be a spectacular program that they're putting together, but it's under development. So just know that what you know is happening is probably happening. It's just the research is saying, how can we quantify this and make it universal so that we know that we can do some good, and what are some good ways that we can do it? Next slide. And some of us were at HLAA, Hearing Loss Association of America, 2 weeks ago, and they had a morning that was a research symposium. And we got to listen firsthand to the researchers talk about stigma. And I learned a lot that they are not even assuming what kind of stigma. Is it a personal stigma? Is it societal? They're figuring out what stigma needs to be addressed, figuring out what are the definitions. They're figuring out that there's different ways that people are looking at it and defining it and measuring it. So they're trying to consolidate all of that work. And then this is a slide of a picture I took. They're even looking at what's the pathway. If you're experiencing, if something happens, then how might some people react? So you can read more about it, but just know that there is great work addressing stigma from a hearing loss perspective. Next slide. And then this one is with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Math. A month ago, they just came out with a short little 200-page report about saying, we know that if somebody walks out of an audiology office and they have pretty good word recognition, they're going to have a really hard time out in the world when it gets into those complex situations. And to move that measurement that, yes, you need to know what's happening in the perfect conditions in the office, but what are the outcomes in those complex situations? How do we measure it so that once we know how to measure it, we can figure out what's going to make it better, easier for people with hearing loss? And also looking at the psychosocial health of it, because we all know that it's frustrating if you can't communicate from both sides. So you can read about it. There's also a nice 4-page summary, and there's also an hour webinar that gives an overview. So you can, if you want to dive into it, you can. Next slide. So if you have a client, figuring out the equipment, figuring out what they have, they're going to need to do some advocacy. And advocacy is not inherent, and it usually takes some development of some skills. Next slide. So Gail Hannon is a great person to read and to watch her videos. She just expresses things so well. There's no shame in having hearing loss. I have the right to participate, to hear, and to be heard, and to have the confidence, because it's really hard to have confidence when it's like, what did they say? Am I going to embarrass myself walking down the hall or contributing? And to have the confidence to say, I can express my needs and I can improve my communication. Next slide. So I was looking and saying, there's a lot of models. What is advocacy for hearing loss? What needs to happen with that? What are some of the frameworks to help a client or to help a patient with hearing loss to be a better self-advocate? And this one from the National Deaf Center, I think, is pretty good. So they have it broken down into 4 areas. So the knowledge of rights, you have to know that you have the right to hear and the right in different settings to hear. There's also the leadership, and I think they're meaning it from the initiative to be the confidence around that. knowledge of self with who you are, how you want to behave, how you want to advocate, but also to have the knowledge of what is your hearing loss and what are you going to need with your hearing loss. So, i.e., I've had this hearing loss for years. I never really understood my audiogram until about 10 years ago because nobody explained it to me. But now I understand it better, and that helps me to know, instantly, like if I walk into some rooms where I'm going to have a hard time. And then to also have those communication skills to be able to request things effectively and to get what you need. Next slide. Some examples for a person with hearing loss. I need to see your face when you are talking rather than saying, "What?" That's the classic line. "What? What did you say?" You're telling the person instead what you need. Can you enunciate? That you prefer CART? So CART is really almost necessary in a medical setting or legal setting. Automatic captions just cannot get all of the terminology, and it also garbles things. Requesting neck loops, turning down the music in a restaurant. Next slide. And the last part is a whole bunch of resources we can all Google, but this will hopefully help you to get started down the right path. Next slide. I'm just going to go through each slide briefly. So these are some of the things that we are doing or have written. So you can click on the links. And I'm happy to do, Juliet did a very stressful TEDx talk, and it's about to hit 1 million viewers, which is extremely rare. And it's just delightful and to help explain to people who don't have hearing loss what hearing loss means and the importance of some of the solutions. Next slide. Then some apps and some blogs. So somebody will ask me, Wynn, what apps do you use? And I'm like, well, what I use is going to be different than the next person. And there are a lot of apps. So Dr. Tina Childress manages a list of them. Go visit her website and that will help. And she also has a lot of like speech to text. So if you're looking for what meets HIPAA, she keeps track of some of that as well. Soundprint is good for restaurants. CHHA, which is the Canadian Hard of Hearing Association, they have a lip reading program. People can follow blogs. There's just a lot of good stuff out there digitally. Next slide. If you like to books or if you want to refer a book, it depends what context. So the first two are by people who live with hearing loss themselves. The first is more of a guided journal, including with just beautiful illustrations. Second edition just came out. The Here and Beyond, the second one is more of a how-to. The third comes from two prominent, well-known doctors, so Dr. Lin and Dr. Reed, but they've translated all of the medical into a very practical, readable book with that. And then the last one is an oral, AURAL, audiologist who wrote about communication success, all about non-technology solutions to communicate better. Older, but just a phenomenal book.
Yeah.
And next slide. So resources for offices, so you can, some ways to be getting that speech to text. Next slide. Yeah.
Oh,
With the fun.
yes.
You have to say that. So yeah, so like last night, I'll just talk about it. So it came up. Last night I was at the social event. I walked in the room. It was all hard surfaces. I did a measurement on my phone. It was up to 85 decibels. I could understand very little last night, even with a person 3 feet away from me. I just couldn't understand. So I had my phone set, click, 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 but it was so noisy, it didn't help me. I got at least more words, but it helps and it's there on the fly. And Juliet has put in like all the details of how to do it so you can just click on your button and you can give it a try. Next slide. And then some more. So we mentioned the clear mask. Here's one that meets surgical standards, and a lovely article about telehealth equity. Next slide. And some resources for emotional side. So there's both the oldies and the goodies, and then the newer ones. A lot of emphasis and continued emphasis with the emotional side. Facebook areas, books, that kind of thing. Next slide. And Michael Harvey has been around a long time, but he writes and presents wonderful things. So some of his resources. Next slide. And so the takeaways, back to what we heard, medical and social models are needed, both and not one or the other. A good signal to noise ratio is critical. Hearing loss can be managed, but it's not fixed. Both technology and communication tools, i.e. non-technology, are needed, and that you and your office can do much to support people with hearing loss. And so take a minute to reflect about what's striking to you today, what you might have learned, and perhaps some ideas that you want to start. So just reflect, and then we'll open it up for questions with Michelle, and in the chat. If you haven't put questions in, we're happy to do that.
Oh, I realize now that we didn't put our emails in the slides. I'll make sure that we do in the copy that we will share with Michelle. And I'm going to stop sharing. Yeah, I'm going to try to stop sharing. Okie dokie.
This is Michelle. Thank you so much. What a wealth of information. I was madly jotting notes, and then I was also texting my dad because he actually talked to me about Auracast for the first time, and he is very proud of himself for knowing about Auracast and for teaching me about that. So I'm like, good job, Dad. So now he wants a copy of this presentation. So I have a few questions while people are jotting down their reflections and thinking of theirs. Dr. Sturkins, you mentioned a speech and noise testing option. I know, like, for some of our students, they can get functional listening assessments like in a school. Do you see that happening for adults? I'm wondering like how that could happen for adults who might be in a day program or who might be in a setting where they have a
Yeah,
hearing aid, but it's not working well.
yeah, there are two different types of speech and noise tests that I'm very familiar with. One is called the BKB, which is a kindergarten level test, which sounds bad, but it's a really easy test for people who are younger or perhaps don't have the language skills. And then there is the quick sin test. And the quick sin test it's a more difficult test and it runs a lot faster. But if you do both tests on a particular individual, you'll be able to see that a person, for example, can't follow fast spoken speech, but by saying, Dad, I'm going to go to the grocery store now, he will hear you. And that test actually uses a carrier phrase, shorter sentences. It's a male voice. And I used both tests in my office so that I can counsel family members and saying, look, you know, your husband can't do the quicksand tests, but if we do the BKB test, he can do it. And what's the difference? And so it allows you to counsel better. That type of test, in my opinion, should be done routinely. Um, There is an app where you can do speech testing on your smartphone, but really it's the provider who should provide or do this test and then provide the interpretation and counseling suggestions in the office.
Thank you so much. So one thing I highly recommend for our behavioral health providers is to make sure that they get a release of information for their person's audiologist, because helping to implement those strategies is a lot easier if you can talk directly to the audiologist, or if the whole team could get together and discuss what this looks
Yeah.
like in an office setting versus what it looks like in the community. So that's a great suggestion. I'm also wondering, back to the RCast and the telecoils. So it is possible now for people to request to have both available in a hearing aid? And is that only in the higher cost hearing aids, or would that also be available for people who may be relying on Medicaid or other insurance to pay for it?
Well, you see how we both got very quiet at this very moment?
Right.
Well,
Win maintains a list on the website, but you want to address it, Win?
yeah, I'll say a few things and we'll go back and forth between the three of us. How's that? So the list that we maintain, so yeah, I do the final things, but we're back and forth on it, is every hearing aid that has telecoils now, which is a pretty long list. Not every hearing aid has it, but it's there. And then starting to be saying which ones have telecoil and Oracast in the device. And that list is just starting. And when I mean starting is there's its continuum. So there's one manufacturer that we're going to be first, and that's our marketing. And on the other end of the continuum is ones that are very reputable, very big, but they're waiting. And they're saying, we want Oracast to mature a little bit more before we release them. And in between, we have ones that say they are Oracast ready or Oracast enabled, which means they're not turned on. So, like in my cochlear, I've had Oracast in it for 2 years, but nobody's turned it on
Mhm.
with that. So, just because a hearing aid doesn't have it, it shouldn't have it because it's not going to do much good. You can only buy, it's just coming out, like a really expensive TV has Oracast. Will it work with every hearing aid? Eventually, but
We
not
don't know
today.
yet.
Right.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings me back to that importance of being person-centered and making sure that whatever individual is sitting in front of you, you're asking, what do you need? What is your life like? How can we work together to help you thrive? And then using some of the many resources you provided today to help make that happen. So I'm wondering, as we kind of wrap up, it's a quiet group today, and they are not usually quiet on these calls. So I am wondering if you have words of wisdom for behavioral health providers, if they're maybe just starting to have those conversations. I think it might be easier for our folks to say, oh, this person needs an interpreter, and to provide that and know what to do, but they might feel more awkward talking about hearing loss for a person who uses other ways of communicating. So are there any words of wisdom or tips you all have for our providers moving forward?
I'll I'll jump in first because what you said, I have an instant story. So I've also been asked to speak to our two medical campuses with brand new med students. And you mentioned one of the first things they talk about is working with people with disabilities. So in that context, one of the students asked us on the panel, do you want the provider to ask you and to talk about your disability? So not, just hearing loss, but just talking about disability or disabilities plural. Do you want us as a provider to talk about it? And so I think begs two answers. So one is what you're talking about, patient-centered. You got to know your client with, do they want to talk about it? Are they comfortable talking about it? So you got to know. And then and that's huge because hearing loss has a big stigma. And if somebody is denying it, you're then outing that they're denying it, which can just
Mhm.
go spin out of control from there.
Mhm.
But sometimes it's necessary because you can't continue to deny it if you're going to be functioning with that. So figuring out that communication is difficult. Once somebody has accepted and not so much denying, I think they're going to be more easily talk about it. And so, like for me, I would welcome it. Very rarely does somebody, I'm usually, it's that medical model. The burden's on me to bring it up,
Mhm.
rather than the provider saying, can you understand me? Or that they recognize that they're going to walk backwards down the hallway and if they want to keep talking to me. So, yeah, what would you add, Juliet?
I would add that assistive technology can be life-changing. Um, and I thought I was doing a pretty good job fitting hearing aids on patients. And I was, as a speech language pathologist in the Netherlands, I was very focused on speech reading and speech discrimination and teaching family members how to communicate with their loved one. But it wasn't until I got involved with publicly installed assistive listening systems. And my patients would say, "Oh, I hear okay in church," or, "Oh, no, I don't go to the theater. The chairs are too small." My dad, it was one of those guys who said that to me. But then when I told him, "You must try the assistive listening system," and it was easy to do that in church because my clients would go to church once a week, and I'd say, "Don't come back to my office until you've tried the hearing loop in your church." And we would practice in the waiting room. And oh my God, on Monday morning, I would get phone calls. They would text me. That's all they wanted to talk to me about in the office, how they were able to hear each and every word in church. And it was like this light went on. Wait a minute. Where else can I hear with my telecoil, right? And so I changed lives. I still get emails from people who watch the TED Talk and say, "Your TED Talk changed my husband's life today." And so, anybody who's listening, you can be that person. You can be that person who educates the person sitting in front of you and say, "Yeah, you may think you're hearing okay because supposedly you have top of the line hearing aids, but trying out that telecoil in the theater by asking for a neck loop and assistive device, you haven't seen nothing yet. You have heard nothing yet, So that's kind of the message that I would like to impart today in this event.
Thank you. I love that. I love the idea of saying, I am a professional with years of experience and I've done a million things. And now I also am supplementing with people's experience with this assistive technology
Yeah.
and doing it where people are comfortable in their churches or in their theaters. When I facilitated a group through our HLAA chapter, everybody's main concerns were, could they go out to the restaurants with their friends? Could they
Hmm.
go to the theater? Could they
Hmm.
just go to a movie and do daily life kinds of things? And hearing loops can make such a difference in those
Yep.
settings. It gives people their lives back in a
Yep.
way that, they may have been afraid to think it was possible. So I thank you both so much for your time, your expertise, and especially your hearts for this work. And I look forward to hopefully continuing the conversation in the future because I know that we have lots of providers who would benefit. I'm going to watch the TED Talk as soon as this is over and then
Thank
probably
you.
share it with lots of people. And I look forward to sharing the PowerPoint too, because there are so many great resources on there. So thank you for your time, for your energy, and for the good that you do in the world. It's been a pleasure to get to know you a little bit today and through this process. Thank
Thank
you
you.
to our interpreters and to our captioner. And also thank you, Anthony, for being our tech person in the background. I hope you all have an excellent day.
Thank you all. Take care.